Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, this is a long overdue video. I'm talking about the debut album from Hudson called Headspaces. I have been sitting on this one for several months. This album came out all the way back in March. I discovered it via a recommendation through a DM from Landon Remixes telling me not to sleep on it, and pointing out that it had a feature from Elon Moore, who I have covered before and rated positively. The fact that someone has a feature from Elon Moore of all people, who I didn't really imagine working with other people in the first place, was interesting in and of itself. Once I actually listened to it for the first time, I figured, okay, I pretty much have to review this. It's such a unique blend and the production is so professional and top-notch, especially since the guy has no label backing aside from an indie label he co-founded himself called Upscale. It's always great to hear non-established producers like him with this little of an audience still be able to make something that sounds this freaking good. But I also felt like I needed to give it more repeat listens because the album was structured in such an abstract way that I need to really familiarize myself with. But I figured it had more than enough detail to fill up a video. About a month and 4 or 5 listens later, I managed to get little to no insight out in written form, and I could barely remember any details about any of the tracks here. Most listens of this thing, all the tracks just blurred together as one giant incoherent blob. As much detail as this album has packed into it, I couldn't make heads or tails of it anymore, and was having a very hard time getting myself to say things about it. I knew I was going to be recommending it highly to people no matter what, but it had basically unclicked with me, and just like that Elon Moore project, my biggest issues with it were also the elements that most set Hudson apart as an artist. Namely the pacing. Very few of these tracks had a well-defined musical identity to set themselves apart from each other. The album itself very much did, but not so much the individual tracks, because all of them shifted around and changed up far too often, and all of them coalesced into one pretty singular vibe. There was also little to nothing in the way of hooks, and most of the tracks focused themselves on very similar instrumental palettes. Ordinarily, that wouldn't be a huge problem, especially given the album as a whole is pretty low-key, but its pacing was so fast that it became hard to get myself immersed in the album's atmosphere, and I don't mean the track's tempo was too fast, I mean they changed up too fast. Tracks would crescendo and decrescendo at a breakneck pace, fragments of build-ups and payoffs would happen in completely random places, and since the actual synth and percussion tones he used tended to resemble those you'd find in your high-budget EDM productions from artists like AU5 or, of course, BT, the low-energy stuff and high-energy stuff kind of clashed for me at the time, ended up with an experience where I had no idea what I was supposed to be feeling. And I bring up the BT comparison in particular. While this stuff absolutely reminds me of his abstract material like This Binary Universe or Underscore, which has a very similar blend of sounds, made into an abstract and low-key project that can make all of these elements work together in a beautiful way. That should really work for me given how I've made clear how much I love albums like those, the former of the two being my second favorite album of all time. Headspaces was too fast-paced, yet also too samey to work to the same degree that those albums do. Again, similar to Elon Moore, that guy had a couple of just really long tracks that would just show flashes of interesting ideas, but only linger on each idea for a second or two before diving into something else entirely. Usually a self-made synthetic cracking ice sound effects. Now this problem is admittedly much more glaring for Elon Moore's longest tracks than it is for anything Hudson has done. Lee does at least keep the experience entirely musical, and actually does at least make his best attempts to make all of his ideas flow together. But I digress. Obviously these are not problems that 99% of artists have to deal with. I can see the sheer amount of detail alone just carrying an immediate listening experience for lots of people and setting him apart as such a unique voice. But it just wasn't clicking on me on an emotional level or giving me much of anything to say from an individual track basis. And, yeah. Anyways, this was my stance on Headspaces around early mid-June. This album was one of the reasons I decided to put together that big Some Stuff I Missed video a while back. Figured this album was going to be one of the first ones I highlighted. But as I was preparing that segment, I gave this album a good full attention listen with iTunes Visualizer and paying attention to the track listing and everything, and I was like, Nah, I think this still needs a full video. These tracks are similar sounding, but it's not like they have no identity apart from each other at all. Then we made it into July, people were posting mid-year lists. I don't do those in video form, I just do them on Twitter, and I included Headspaces in the list, purely for how impressed I was by its craft. The artist himself seemed to appreciate my inclusion, so that gave me more motivation to get a video done on this guy. I gave it a few more listens, waited a few more months, and I'm probably at listen like 10 or 11 at this point. But it's far better to me now than it was like 2 months ago, and I think it has finally properly clicked with me on an emotional level. All my criticisms that I've mentioned above, I won't act like it's all completely worn off. I'm obviously never going to be holding this thing on the same personal level as those BT albums I mentioned, but I do think I finally made it to the point where I've gotten used to this album's pacing and general lack of structure, and doesn't bother me nearly as much as it did before. I do still think this album would need more immediate hooks and more well-defined and focused track ideas to really rise to a transcendent level for me, but it's pretty damn great as is. And I no longer have trouble getting myself immersed in the sound. So, alright, let's finally talk about individual tracks. I still don't have super detailed thoughts on every track, some just blend into the sounds of the rest of the album without leaving a strong impression on me. Usually the ones that don't have any featuring credits actually, but not all of them. I'll discuss everything that comes readily to mind. I think my least favorite moment on this thing is actually the opener, Suspended. While I suppose it sets the tone in a low-key sort of way, lets you know what you're getting into, atmosphere-wise and everything. If it were not the first track, I may as well have not noticed it was there at all. It really isn't much of a standout in the context of the album. The singer, Lassa Patique, sorry for butchered pronunciations per usual, she's a good singer, she's a likable presence, she has a very Lorde-like quality to her voice that's pretty nice. But she also sings on like half the tracks on this album, if not more. There's several where she's not even directly credited. She is just a constant presence on this project, so as a result, while this first track was cool on first listen, it shrunk on me with repeat visits, as it felt less special and overall weaker compared to other moments on here where she plays a key role. Tracks like Paper Planes and Summer Nights, those have much more memorable hooks and melodies, so they stuck with me much more. And also Labyrinth was a pretty nice emotional high point, delivered more for me than the opener did as well. All those tracks are pretty big highlights for me. But she's also got an uncredited spot on Drowning. She was also sampled on Patience. That one tends to mostly just blend in the mix of the album without me noticing it's being there. She's on Me and Her, which wasn't a huge standout for me either, despite the clever title, but still pretty nice. That one's also a duet with a male singer who isn't credited, possibly Lee himself? I get the feeling that one's a bigger standout for him, personally. And there's a couple of others she appears on, but whatever. While she's not exactly a super attention-grabbing force of personality, she is a pretty big part of this album's whole identity. In a lot of ways, this album is just as much hers as it is Hudson Lee's. But there are other vocal guests besides just her, and they do thankfully add some much-needed variety, like Laura Brem on Stay. She's not a super unique voice either, and the out-of-nowhere 2-second rap verse was kinda awkward, but she is recognizably different from Lassa Patique, and I appreciate her being there. There's also Evoke on the track Drowning. He was also on that AU5 project, though I wouldn't have realized if I hadn't randomly clicked his name on the Discogs page. But he's also much more impactful presence here than he was there, and the emotion and message of this track being about depression and the way it's described I thought was pretty spot on, and additionally one of the most memorable melodies. This was a big favorite for me. All these vocal tracks, while many of them can be very abstract and strange, they still feel very intimate and personal. There's a lot of acoustic guitars on this album, which help bring the sound down to earth, much in the same way Triphonic operate. This album is a pretty similar blend to what they did on their Emergence album, though they lended towards slightly more predictable and conventional song structures than Hudson Lee's sonic meandering. I think my favorites, though, tend to be the instrumentals, and specifically the ones with co-producers. And surprisingly, the Elon Moore collab, Depth, wasn't one of the hugest standouts for me. I mean, don't get me wrong, that one was pretty great with all its orchestral tones and rich instrumentation, and it is placed very well in the album as this big emotional moment before the low-key final breather that is the closer, Subside. But first of all, it wasn't even the only track to have that vast orchestral bend to it. Labyrinth, for instance, does that stuff too. But more importantly, I just think I was even more impressed with all the other producer collabs on here. Maybe because I didn't have as high expectations for them, because I already heard Long Awaited Journey and knew that album was amazing. I'd heard of all these other artists, but haven't really listened to most of them. But the other producer guests are all like Lee's label mates on the Upscale label. There's the other label co-founder Frequent on the track Windows. Vorso appears on Paper Dreams. False Noise appears on both Way of Thought and Lost. And all of these tracks were really quick favorites. Especially the False Noise collabs. Like, I mean, I've only actually heard one False Noise track. I think it was called Emerald Green or something. It was something that Landon promoted on the Gargantua Music channel back when that was active. But yes, these two collabs mainly stand out for being much noisier and more in-your-face than the others. They just popped out more to me. They have a lot of synth tones that feel really raw and aggressive, though still not clashing with the more understated tones and ambient side tracks elsewhere in these tracks. Way of Thought definitely has the feel of like this big climactic emotional moment for the album, while Lost kinda has like this bouncier and funkier feel to it that reminds me a lot of something you'd hear out of an artist like Zircon. Well, the first half of this track does, at least. The end of it goes towards this more peaceful, piano-driven stuff with xylophone-ish sounds bouncing around the mix. But yeah, there's actually a couple of other tracks that have that bouncy, funky, Zircon-ish feel. Paper Dreams with Vorso's probably the most notable example. Probably the funkiest track in the bunch with all its glitch-hop, stuttering noises and samples that add up to a stunning and even relatively danceable mix. Also one of the few tracks here where it feels like the whole track is building momentum and paying off in a natural way. I get similar vibes off of Adrift, though that one has a lot more of the jerky stop-start quality that many of these tracks on this thing do, which, you know, I know I crapped a lot on that jerky stop-start feel in the beginning of this video, but I did eventually get used to it. It's not that big a problem for me anymore. And for what it's worth, Adrift is, in fact, the moment where I most often really start to get into the rhythm and pacing of the album. That may as well be the real opener, while Suspended is just its prologue. The closer, Subside, definitely also has a bit of that bouncy energy as well. Though it's much more low-key with all its focus on electric piano chords. Might be a tad jazz-influenced, even. It's a nice one to go out on. And the last track I have to note is the collab with Frequent, called Windows. I have yet to hear any of Frequent's solo stuff. I got recommended his album Dream Recall from 2017 a few times, but that one unfortunately fell through the cracks. Really should check that out at some point. I've heard nothing but massive praise for it. But anyways, Windows is the longest track on the album, and fittingly is the most complex and odd tune in the bunch. Well, sometimes using the word tune feels like it's stretching it, because there are sections of this track which have all these loud and aggressive noises, which sound like they're taken out of some 2014 modern dubstep electro house production, though also playing in really off-kilter rhythms. But there are also more melodic and delicate guitar sections. It changes around a ton, has a really unpredictable structure, but it actually never outright feels jarring. So I guess that's about all I got from an individual track basis. I mean, obviously there has been no shortage of material to discuss. But it has taken me a long time to, like, just verbalize all my thoughts on this stuff and, you know. So I guess time for final thoughts. This album seems to basically have everything. I mean, it's got loud moments, quiet moments, moments that sound really big and expansive, moments that sound really small and contained. It's got intimate and melodic guitar-driven songwriterly stuff, glitchy and wild breakdowns, funky and foot-tapping moments, ambient sidetracks, stripped-back piano balladry. Sometimes all of those in the same track. Yet no matter how herky-jerky and complex all these tracks are, they all add up to a rather low-key mood that isn't really demanding your attention, but still carries a lot of emotional weight and feels very personal to him. Not to mention, this guy is already just totally mastered album flow. Like, this album is pretty much completely seamless. I complained about not always being able to notice tracks individually as a side effect of that, but I can't get too mad in that department because it's clearly an album meant to be digested as a full, unbroken piece. For this to be this guy's debut album, all his previous releases being singles directly included on this album, this is one hell of a way to make a first impression. This album has already been a pretty big part of my 2019 given how much time I've spent parsing my feelings on it, figuring out how to best handle covering him in video form, changing my mind on how I feel on any specific track, and he's only just grown on me since I first discovered him. Guy's almost certainly gonna be making my year-end list, but only time will tell where exactly he will be landing. Headspaces has definitely not been an immediate experience or one that I feel is like just an absolute flawless masterpiece. Even now, most of my enjoyment from this thing still comes from my being impressed at its incredible technical achievements, rather than a visceral emotional reaction to it. But that emotional reaction is slowly forming more and more every time I put this on. I'm getting into it like on a Black Dog Spanners level. It's the kind of album that I can listen to over and over and notice new things every time I put it on. But yeah, needless to say, I feel this guy is 100% worth highlighting and worth your time to check out. Maybe let it sit with you a while if it doesn't hit right away. I've no idea where Hudson Lee will be going from here, but I'll certainly be interested to find out because this is one very impressive start. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. If they're awesome people, you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.